So we are back with another Showdown in the Badlands card review. Today it's all priest cards, including kind of a brand new archetype, totally new deck synergy here for about half the cards. And it all starts here with Pip the Potent, the other priest legendary. Remember, we already saw Elise, the Highlander card, but Pip the Potent here is a 4-mana 3/5 with Battle Cry. Copy each one cost card in your hand. You might be thinking, well, why are there a lot of one cost cards that I'm really excited to copy? Well, maybe not, but there are potentially going to be even more because of some support cards here. There is a new cycle of kind of excess cards, I'll call them. Cards like Holy Springwater here restore 8 health to a damaged character, save any excess in a 1-cost bottle. And then you have your bottled Springwater, 1-mana spell, restore the excess health to a damaged character. And then we've got Swarm of Lightbugs, summon 10 1/1 Lightbugs with Lifesteal, save any excess in a 1-cost bottle. There's your 1-cost bottle of Lightbugs. That would very often summon you, at least 3 Lightbugs for 1 mana, for instance. Then the Invasive Shade Leaf, deal 8 damage to an enemy minion, save any excess in a 1-cost bottle. So you've got these 3 1-cost bottle cards that might have some pretty efficient effects for one that you can copy. And then we've got the Thirsty Drifter here, which is going to cost 1 less for each 1-cost card you've played this game. So this is, one of those nice kind of free board swing cards, basically, after you've slammed all your 1-cost cards. So Pip the Potent here, giving you, bonus copies of those really efficient cards. Thirsty Drifter hopefully swinging the board pretty hard, and you've kind of got yourself a little bit of a deck going. Now, of course, those aren't the only 1-cost cards available to Priest. I think one particularly interesting line might be the Astral Automaton. Getting extra copies of Astral Automatons, I want to see that again. That sounds fun to me. So that's one possibility, and then I'll just actually show you the other 1-cost priest cards. I may not show you all the neutral cards, but you can see some other interesting stuff. Animate Deads, some Serpent Wigs. Copying Serpent Wigs and like a Priestess Valish could actually be a pretty sick sort of combo. Get yourself some extra Shard of the Narus, and so on. I don't know if you're going to be able to build a whole deck of 1-cost cards that Pip the Potent pays off. That might be a little too all in, but you could see this being a supporting piece in a couple different directions there. An Automaton deck, a Naga, a Serpent Wig deck, of course, an excess deck like we're seeing here. And the Thirsty Drifter could also, of course, splash into a lot of those as well. So this is a big value generating bomb for sure in those decks that do care a lot about having those significant 1-cost payoff cards, which I was kind of surprised how many Priest actually does have in that scenario where they kind of care about that. So to me, that actually makes Pip the Potent look pretty interesting. I'm not totally sold on this 1-cost excess package, which we'll talk about as we go through each of these cards individually. So I don't know if Pip is actually potent enough to make these excess cards feel totally worth it. They don't necessarily have like the game-ending nature that I think they might need, or even the game swinging nature necessarily that they might need. So that makes me a little more nervous for this whole package as a whole, but I do think Pip is still a pretty interesting card even outside of that. And on that note, I think the Thirsty Drifter here has a lot of potential as well. We've seen so many cards like this prove themselves time and time again in Hearthstone. Anytime you have these taunt bodies, we've even seen examples that are literally 4/6 taunts where they go down to a low cost 0, even 1 or 2, right? They can really provide some stabilization. And I think even like a Control Priest deck probably has enough natural 1-drops that they're running or able to run. Weave in a Holy Smite, weave in a Shard of the Naru, Light It Burns ×2. You've suddenly got yourself some really nice swingy Thirsty Drifters maybe coming down, in the mid game, helping you swing the board really nicely, helping you stabilize against aggro decks. This might be the kind of card that even makes a cut in something like Control Priest, especially if there are any ways to discover 1-cost cards, some stuff like that feeding into it. Could go a really long way towards giving this card that life outside of like an excess deck or a 1-cost deck. But also, imagine this in a Serpent Wig deck. actually still kind of makes a lot of sense. You're just looking for like cheap stuff to play to develop your board alongside your big threats with your Naga package. And if it's going to be 0 mana to toss it in for free and potentially have something you can buff or build on or survive through or protect those other assets, that could be a really valuable addition as well. So I actually think this card also looks pretty interesting. Now, as for the excess cards themselves, I don't think these are necessarily bad, but I don't know that they're enough to like fill out a deck or maybe necessarily even be included in a deck. But let's talk through these a little more in detail because I may change my mind a little bit. These just got revealed, right? The Holy Spring Water is a 2-mana holy spell. It'll restore 8 health to a damaged character, save any of that excess in a 1-cost bottle. So, you know, if it heals 5, that's going to save 3 excess. That's going to go into your bottled spring water. That'll have a 1-cost heal 3 basically. Note there are some keywords here. It has to be a damaged character, so you can't just like heal your face at the start of the game and bank a 1-cost heal 8. Now that said, 7 is kind of your max here for the Holy Spring Water. And don't get me wrong, a 1-mana heal 7 is above rate, but we have, flash heals in the game. So 1/7's not crazy. And I think more realistically, 1/3s, 1/4s, 1/5s, it's going to be basically a fair card, the bottled spring water that is. Now that said, you still kind of get, 8 total, which for 3 mana is kind of a healing touch. Still doesn't really feel that good. I think you're probably most excited about it with overheal cards. I think this will still proc overheal cards, even if it's saving the excess. If it doesn't, I mean, that feels unintuitive and bad. I mean, it kind of makes sense that it wouldn't if the like excess is not being applied and it's being kind of pulled out separately. So I don't know, I guess we'll find out. But that would just be another downside for the card if it didn't work with overheal stuff. So ultimately, there are definitely some concerns about the kind of output here basically for the Holy Spring Water. Now I will remind you, we did see like the Shadow Touch Cavaldier get revealed last expansion in the mini set or whatever. Like this, if you did get some 1/7s, like you could kind of maybe use it for burst damage. It's still, I don't know, man, like flash heals are just there and they just work and you don't have to pay the 2 first. You don't have to worry about the math. So it just, I don't know, man. I feel like the numbers could actually be pushed on this a little bit and it wouldn't be too crazy. And I don't think like copying these bottled spring waters to have another, slightly beyond rate base heal is necessarily going to be worth it. So to me, Holy Spring Water, probably the least exciting of these like bottled excess cards for sure. Now Swarm of Lightbugs is a little bit more interesting. It's a 5-mana spell. It summons you 10 1/1 light bugs. Of course, there's only 7 spaces on a Hearthstone board, so that naturally means you're going to have 3 excess, even if you play this on an empty board. Then your bottled light bugs is a 1-mana summon 3 1/1s with lifesteal, and that's definitely nice. Like that's way above what you'd expect for a 1-mana spell, and that's cool. But it's it's still one of those things where priest is not traditionally the best class at benefiting from those like wide token boards. And if that were in druid, obviously it might be insane. It might be totally broken and busted. Priest is going to have a hard time turning those into additional upside. It's not bad, 1/1's a little bit of healing. There's some buff cards in priest, etc. There are ways to use those, but it's not going to feel as rewarding as it might in other places. It's just going to feel solid, I think. Now, maybe it's crazier if you have a board when you play your Swarm of Light Bugs. Maybe you have a previous bottled light bug saved up and then you get your new Swarm of Light Bugs and you like summon 3 and then you try to summon 10, but there's only 4 spaces. So then you have like a 1-mana summon 6 light bugs, and then you copy that with your pip and you've got a couple 1-mana summon 6. Like that starts to get intriguing and you can kind of build wave after wave of these light bug boards. But again, without a way to leverage those into game ending pressure or a game winning board, they do get swept up really easily. They only heal for a little bit. So it is definitely efficiency, but it kind of feels like efficiency without, significant output. And then also the 5 mana you're spending up front is pretty significant as well. A lot of the time that 5 mana play is just going to get cleaned up by some cheap AoE or something. And it'll feel like you're investing into the future. But again, you're investing in a way that doesn't really give you anything that's substantial or game ending or even really game plan advancing. I don't know how you turn this into a scenario where you're doing something significant, basically. So it's hard to argue the efficiency, but where does it go? And then finally, we have the Invasive Shade Leaf here. This is a 4-mana shadow spell. Deal 8 damage to an enemy minion. Save any of that excess in a 1-cost bottle. So, it's turn 4. Maybe you hit, 3, 4, 5 health minion. And you get, 3, 4 remainder here in your excess. You got a 1-mana, deal 4. Again, very efficient. You can't argue that that's more efficient, but still yet, in total, you don't feel great about playing the Shade Leaf itself. Like spending 4 mana to just remove a minion and set up for later doesn't feel great. And then the Shade Leafs, the bottled Shade Leafs, I mean, they're okay, but, copying them with Pip, for instance, okay, I got a couple more cheap removal cards. It's still often not as good as something like Light It Burns, and it took a lot of extra work, basically, to get it there. And again, it's just efficiency without like significant value or game ending pressure, which may sound like a broken record, I know, but that's important. If you're going to run all these cards, if you're going to commit to this package, if it's going to be such a significant portion of your deck, it needs to do something really significant. Perhaps you can just toss this into a Control Priest and hope that the raw efficiency of all of this kind of carries you, but I'm worried about the upfront costs on all of those, because some of the most important turns for Control Priest to stabilize are those early game turns, and you may not have as much time to play the Invasive Shade Leaf to get yourself to where the bottled Shade Leaf feels good, and like the Pip's gonna be hard, Thirsty Drifters are gonna come down awkwardly late. I don't know, it feels like it may not do enough. Now that said, if you can find the time to play that, like clearly you're gonna have some baller turns, when you start spamming all these 1-cost cards and you get your thirsty down, like that's gonna feel good. But there's just that kind of gap in the middle where I'm really nervous. So I don't know, I hate to be a downer on these cool new cards, because I think the designs are very cool. Like this is a very neat design, but I almost feel like you could take 1 mana off of each of these and they would still feel okay, and they would probably be notably more playable in that case. Now that said, I'm actually still pretty high on Pip and Thirsty Drifter, just not necessarily the excess cards that are kind of designed here to support them. So next up here we have the Benevolent Banker, a 3-mana 2/4 Battlecry. Discover a spell from your deck and quick draw the enemy deck instead. So a couple things to note there. This does not use the word copy, so that is an implication for both your deck and the opponents. That means you're not getting anything extra out of your deck here. This is really just helping you tutor towards a specific spell you're looking to find sooner. Maybe that like on curve turn 4 spell to help you follow up on the banker. Maybe you're looking for some specific, big board removal or something against an aggro deck. And for the enemy deck instead, that means you're actually going to be taking the card from them. Whereas most of the Thief Priest stuff is all about copies and rewards you for playing copies. This is actually not going to be a copy based on this wording. It's just going to take it right away from them. So it has that disruption effect built in as well. You can take a key card from them if they happen to have a spell that they really care about, maybe even just some burst damage from a deck that's looking to burn you down as a priest. That could help you feel a little bit safer behind some of your health totals, for instance. Maybe some key legendary spell they're looking for, right? This has that option, or maybe just something that's useful for you. It's not always going to be about the disruption, because if it's not some key piece of their deck, if they're not drawing into that fatigue anyway, they may never have seen that card regardless. So you're just looking for something that's useful for you. And of course, that can definitely be the case when you have Discover instead of just getting something random. You're gonna be able to pick a card that's a good fit for you instead. Now, how often are you going to be hitting quick draw on this? Not a majority of the time. The way Priest plays very often, this might be hard actually to get off on a quick draw, because you need to do certain reactive things at certain times, and you won't always have, sort of 3 mana to float into a turn to spare for the Benevolent Banker the turn you draw it. And of course, the odds of drawing it exactly on turn 3 or something in the early game are pretty slim as well. So I think the quick draw here will actually be more rare than consistent, but sometimes just tutoring a spell out of your deck is absolutely fine as well. And if you do use any of those like shuffle cards, we saw the Gaslight Gatekeeper or whatever yesterday. You know, this is one of those quick draw cards that would definitely benefit from shuffling cards back in your deck and redrawing it. I don't think the upside here is that high, though, for that to really be a thing in Priest without additional support. But that said, you know, just an okay looking card. Priest has a lot of tools that do similar sorts of things that probably carve out more total value than this card does. So that does leave me with some questions on it. So speaking of value, we've got the Tram Heist here, new 4-mana spell. Get a copy of each card that your opponent played last turn. So of course, if you play this late in the game, your opponent played 3 or 4 cards, you're going to get a bunch of stuff back here off the Tram Heist. I think the big question and concern is, are you going to care about that stuff? Is it going to be things that are useful for your game plan or your archetype? And does Priest just have enough ways to generate value that they don't need a card like this? Particularly other ways to generate value that probably better fits their game plan or archetype, you know, greedier, more priestly things as opposed to like some random hunter cards that you just don't really have any use case for. Not to mention, you know, if you're spending the 4-mana overhead on this, you're never really kind of matching your opponent's turn. If they have a really big turn and do something awesome and you try to copy it, you're going to be behind because you're not going to have so much mana to replay the cards basically that they did. So it's going to kind of always be on a little bit of a delay. It does to me feel like this card probably could have been cheaper. Maybe they had to keep it this cost for things like Titans. They may not have wanted you to be able to copy, you know, the opponent's Titan for 2 mana or something and then immediately replay the Titan. Perhaps that felt a little bit too swingy. But as a result, as a 4-mana card here, I don't know, man. This one feels pretty pricey for me when there are so many ways for Priests to do similar things that probably just work better for them most of the time. So now we got Posse Possession, another 4-mana spell. This one's a shadow spell that summons a 4/4 copy of a random minion in your opponent's hand, which honestly, a vast majority of the time is just going to be a 4/4. It's going to have like some battle cry or something that of course doesn't resolve or go off. You might occasionally get a nice bonus keyword like taunt or rush or something, but very often this is not going to feel like a very good result. Now that said, you know, there are obvious high rolls like Titans that are out there, and you could potentially, you know, cheat a Titan into play on turn 4. How often is that going to happen though? You know, 1 in 5 games, 1 in 10 games, because it's not just about, you know, hitting the Titan they have in hand. They have to have the Titan in hand as early as turn 4 if you're trying to play this on turn 4, right? And most people don't sit on Titans for very long once they get into the late game and, you know, have the mana to spend it. So you have a pretty brief window probably where the Posse Possession can actually hit. And then it's still going to hit, you know, rarely within that context as well for those really big payoff sort of cards. And then the rest of the time, I don't think you're just happy enough with a meager 4/4 that basically does nothing that this feels worth it, right? There's always an opportunity cost to running cards. Like, yeah, it'd be fine. And I'll see a lot of comments and say, it's fine, I'll just get a 4/4. But that's not really what you're comparing it against. You're not comparing it against the void of all possible things that can happen in Hearthstone. You're comparing it against a deck slot that could be something else. Would you rather run a removal card, a value generator, a 4-drop that just offers you something consistent, you know? I would rather have a school teacher instead of a Posse Possession. I can't fit all these 4-drops in my deck. This sort of falls to the bottom of the pile, right? So it definitely feels like one of those cards that is just, again, too inconsistent and maybe a little bit too expensive. If this were like 3 mana and you really felt like the 4/4 had some board presence and upside from a stat standpoint, maybe you could tank that inconsistency a little bit. But with this really honest stat line for its cost, I'm not sure you can. So next up here is the Injured Hauler. Too many cactuses, clearly. It's a 3-mana 3/7 Battlecry, deal 4 damage to this minion, so that has major Injured Blade Master vibes. Slightly different stat line there, but this has a little bonus. Overheal, deal 2 damage to all enemy minions. So if you manage to heal this back up to 7 and then a little more for that overheal proc, then this becomes a bit of a reactive mini board clear of sorts, which It's kind of intriguing, right? I don't actually think this makes a lot of sense in something like a control priest deck. They have plenty of other ways to remove minions and have super consistent AoEs that don't demand kind of a card and then additional follow-ups pumped into it and stuff to proc this overheal. But this does become a little bit intriguing to me in a more minion-based overheal sort of deck, where that often lacks a little bit of reactivity. Some of those overheal packages are about building your board of overheal stuff. And if you do fall behind a little bit or just want to handle the opponent's board while still, cementing your pressure to face, it can lack some tools for that. You have to maybe take some really bad trades or just kind of leave your opponent's stuff there. And you feel a little bit stuck sometimes in those board versus board battles, or at least you feel like you're wasting too much time kind of trading and then rehealing and so on. But a card like this, if you got that down, you could kind of use this as your way to keep your opponent's stuff in check while still advancing your minion overheal game plan. I think particularly, if you resurrect this with something like Animate Dead, this becomes really interesting because you don't have to pump the 3 health into it. It's just rezzed as a 3/7 ready to overheal, and suddenly it doesn't take quite as much numerical input to start proccing this effect, which could be the sort of thing that makes this really powerful. Now, that said, we haven't really seen that board-based overheal deck work, and this does not feel like the sort of card that is strong enough to get it over the hump. This is not the kind of critical mass that needs to be achieved for that deck to succeed. So, I don't see that happening yet. Maybe put this in your back pocket a little bit for later. Keep this in mind. It's got some output. It's got some potential. Definitely just needs a lot of support to get that archetype there. And I think it only works in that really specific context. I don't think this is as much of a general use card. Pip the Potent is a 4-star card. Thirsty Drifter is a 4-star card. Holy Springwater is a 2-star card. Swarm of Lightbugs is a 3-star card. Invasive Shadeleaf is a 2-star card. Benevolent Banker is a 3-star card. Tram Heist is a 2-star card. Posse Possession is a 2-star card. Injured Hauler is a 3-star card. And there you go, folks. That's Priest and Showdown in the Badlands. We also got the Elise, which doesn't really seem to synergize particularly well with these. She summons like 4/4 copies of minions in your deck, which these don't really benefit from that in any way or any of the cards that we saw. So she kind of stands on her own, and then this package is pretty cool design. I'm still not sure it's going to be a deck, but maybe you think so. Tell me if so. Maybe you're really high on this package. You think it's going to be awesome? I want to hear all those thoughts and more in the comments below. Stay tuned for more reviews. Tomorrow, I guess there'll be new stuff. And until next time, game on.